So you want to learn about dominance. Let's say that you have blonde hair, but both your parents have brown hair. You want to know why. Well, to find out, we need to look at your genes. You receive 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. These genes can be identical, or they can be slightly different versions. We call these versions alleles. Different alleles code for different versions of proteins, and thus give you different traits. The blonde hair allele will give you blonde hair. The brown hair allele will give you brown hair, through the pigments that those alleles produce. Dominance is when certain alleles take precedent over other alleles when it comes to deciding your traits. Having a dominant allele means you will exhibit that allele's trait, regardless of the other allele you have. To express a recessive allele, you would need to only have recessive alleles, because a dominant one would overpower it. So let's look at your parents and you and try to figure out which allele, brown or blonde, is dominant. If blonde is dominant, that means that if you have even 1 copy of the blonde allele, you will have blonde hair. Therefore, you need 2 brown alleles to have brown hair. Your parents must both have only brown alleles. Then they would only be able to pass down brown alleles to you, giving you brown hair. But you don't have brown hair, you have blonde hair. Therefore, this cannot be the case. Now let's think about what would happen if brown was dominant. If you have a brown allele, you have brown hair. You would need 2 blonde alleles to have blonde hair. Therefore, you must have 2 blonde alleles. Each parent must have passed down at least 1 blonde allele. But they don't have blonde hair, so they must have 1 brown allele and 1 recessive blonde allele. This is why you have blonde hair when your parents both have brown. Brown is dominant and blonde is recessive. Why would certain alleles be dominant? Each allele codes for a specific version of a protein. Genes code for proteins, and alleles are just slightly different versions of genes. So, if the hair color allele codes for pigment, the brown allele will code for a brown pigment. The blonde allele won't code for any pigment due to a change in the DNA. So if you have 2 brown alleles, you'll have brown proteins and have brown hair. If you have 1 brown allele and 1 blonde allele, you'll still be producing brown proteins and have brown hair. Only if you have 2 blonde alleles will you have blonde hair, because no one is producing the brown pigment. The dominant recessive model is one of many ways alleles interact, and there are many others too. Let's look at a few to get a better understanding of how alleles dictate our traits. Sometimes you have multiple alleles, and they can have a dominance order. Basically, who overrules who when it comes down to the traits. For example, let's look at rabbit fur. The dark gray fur allele is dominant to all other alleles, so if a bunny has at least 1 dark gray fur allele, it will have dark gray fur. Light gray fur is next in line. If a bunny has light gray fur, it means that it has at least 1 light gray fur allele and no dark gray fur alleles. Finally, white is recessive to both dark gray and light gray fur alleles, and so a bunny must have 2 white fur alleles to have white fur. Alleles also don't have to be dominant or recessive. They can have incomplete dominance, where the 2 alleles work together to make the trait. For example, hair shape. The curly hair allele and the straight hair allele are 2 alleles for hair shape. The curly hair allele makes curly hair. The straight hair allele makes straight hair, but neither is dominant to the other, so when you have 1 curly hair allele and 1 straight hair allele, you get wavy hair, a mix of the 2 traits. 2 alleles can also be fully expressed at the same time if they are co-dominant. We can look at blood type to see an example of this. There are 3 alleles for blood type. Allele A causes a blood cell to create A proteins and have A antigens. Allele B causes a blood cell to create B proteins and have B antigens. Allele I doesn't make any protein and thus causes no antigens. A blood cell with allele A will have type A antigens. A blood cell with allele B will have type B antigens. So if a blood cell has alleles A and B, it will have both A and B antigens. This is codominance. Both A and B are dominant to I. Having 2 I alleles and no antigens is called type O. I hope this helped you understand dominance a little bit more. Go out there and learn some genetics.